probably. Okay, thank you, Kanisha. Thank you everyone who is joining us this evening, either in person or remotely. Thank you to TPIC for organizing this year's Public Interest Week and making this event possible. Tonight we're going to talk about the unique challenges faced by individuals with criminal records or justice-involved individuals who seek to attain employment. The challenges here are many, in part arising from a cultural stigma attached to a criminal record, and in part due to specific policy choices that create opportunities for tacit discrimination or outright opportunity reduction. The cumulative effect of all of these factors is especially relevant during the pandemic, when in the early part last spring, several industries that traditionally employ people with criminal backgrounds were shuttered or closed, and now, later in the pandemic, as job reports indicate that there are more open positions than individuals seeking work, and employers may have to broaden their pool of talent to individuals they otherwise overlooked. We're lucky to be joined this evening by three wonderful panelists, each of whom have unique and interesting perspectives to contribute to this conversation. So we'll start with introductions, and then we'll kind of jump into the content. We'll begin with Ames Grauertz, our individual appearing remotely this evening. Ames is a senior counsel and John L. New Justice Counsel in the Brennan Center's Justice Program. Ames leads the program's quantitative research team, and he specifically focuses on trends in crime and policing and the collateral costs of mass incarceration. Previously, Ames served as an ADA in the Appeals Bureau of the Nassau County Attorney's Office, and he is a co-author of the Brennan Center report that inspired tonight's conversation, and we'll give him an opportunity to jump in and describe that work in a few moments. Moving on to our panelists who are appearing in person, we'll start with Jeff Abramowitz, who is Vice Chair of the Philadelphia Reentry Coalition, which is the city's preeminent effort to coordinate the efforts of over 120 organizations working to improve reentry in the city. Jeff is the founder of the Looking Forward Community Engagement Partnership, the National Workforce Opportunity Network, and is involved in more reentry programs than I could say tonight. Jeff is also a keynote speaker and lecturer in the topics of workforce development, prison reform, and criminal justice. Finally, Professor Sandra Mason teaches here at Penn Law in the subjects of criminal law, evidence, and related seminars. 1L students, she may teach you in criminal law this spring. She has served as an associate reporter for the Uniform Law Commission's Pretrial Release and Detention Acts, co-authors amicus briefs and lawsuits challenging money bail systems, and regularly advises public and private stakeholders on pretrial reform initiatives. Prior to entering academia, Professor Mason practiced as a trial attorney and Equal Justice Works Fellow at Orleans Public Defenders in New Orleans. Of particular significance to this event, Professor Mason published an article titled Collateral Consequences and the Preventative State in the 2015 Notre Dame Law Review. So now we'll turn to a few housekeeping points before jumping into the panel. To submit a question virtually, please use the Q&A feature found on the ribbon at the bottom of the Zoom window. In-person attendees, please use the note cards that are at the end of the aisles to write down any questions that you may have this evening. For those of you who are in the room, please make sure that your devices are silenced, and please refrain from eating indoors. We are recording this lecture, and the recording will be shared after the event to all attendees. And lastly, the CLE portion. If you are attending and seeking CLE credit for tonight's events, please note that the CLE passwords will be announced twice per hour. Write down these passwords and enter them on the digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory for both in-person and virtual attendees seeking credit in order to receive CLE. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email. If you did not receive the email, if you are on the webinar, please find the link in the evaluation form in the chat, or if you're in person, you can scan the QR code upon the conclusion of the event right outside the classroom. The first password is cookie. The first password is cookie. All right, now we're ready for some content, I think. So Ames, we'll begin the conversation with you, as your report was a catalyst for this event, and it sets the stage for our discussion this evening. Your 2020 report quantifies the aggregate result of a job market that is unduly restricted for individuals with criminal records. As you dive into that work and share its findings, I hope that you'll take a second to share with our audience, some of whom may be a little bit unfamiliar with the Brennan Center's work, about how a report like this factors into the organization's mission and how an attorney can find themselves doing quantitative surveys like this one. Thank you very much, Ames.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's just a real pleasure to be here. I wish I could be there in person with you. Nothing would give me more joy than to jump on the Acela and join you all, but glad to be here in one way or another. If you don't mind, I'll share my screen so I can share with you some of the findings from that report. Can you all see this?
Yes.
All right, great. So yeah, good evening and thank you for having me here. I'm excited to talk some about the Brennan Center's work on the relationship between poverty and mass incarceration. In my experience on panels, the best part is the exchange of ideas between the panels themselves. So I'm going to keep this brief because I definitely want to hear from the other incredible people that you have invited alongside me. So I will keep it quick. But by way of background, I'm senior counsel in the Brennan Center's Justice Program. The Justice Program is our initiative focused on ending mass incarceration, documenting the costs of it, both direct and collateral, and proposing solutions to it as well. We're sort of interesting, and for the benefit of law students, we're a sort of interesting law shop, I suppose, in that unlike some of the Brennan Center's other work that you might be familiar with as well, we don't really litigate so much. Our theory of change is more that we produce reports that we think will be persuasive to policymakers, and then we use those reports as a way of convincing policymakers to adopt new ideas for reducing mass incarceration. This report I'm going to tell you about tonight has been a really great part of that effort. It's been it took years to work through, but the investment has been repaid, I think, in the entree we've gotten to people who have been interested in its findings. And I'm really happy to tell you all about that later if you'd like. If you're at this event, I probably don't have to tell you about the reality of mass incarceration. You can see on the slide the steady growth of the American prison population over the intervening 60 to 70 years or so. I'm guessing it's not a surprise to many of the people here, but it's probably worth just reflecting on the incredible growth in the number of people who have spent time behind bars at some point in their lives, and the number of people annually behind bars in this graph. You're probably also familiar with the fact that the consequences of time in prison don't end upon release. Very, very far from it. There's significant research showing that people who end up in prison are disproportionately likely to come from lower income communities and to deal with other forms of socioeconomic disadvantage. Prison Policy Initiative has done some incredible work on this. They're also more likely to face systematic and legal discrimination in hiring after they're released from prison. And paradoxically or ironically, low earnings are then correlated with an increased likelihood of incarceration. So one of the sad realities of what we've created in this country in mass incarceration is a cycle whereby poverty leads to incarceration and incarceration leads to poverty. And these effects are intergenerational. We know this from significant additional research. This is not something that ends at the end of a prison stay or at the end of a life, which I think is really tragic. So the reason we set out to do this report is there's general agreement among researchers that time in prison reduces earnings and reduces employment too. There's also some background research on how many people have been to prison or been impacted by a criminal record of some form. We wanted to contribute to that research both to give a bigger picture of how many people have interacted with the criminal justice system in some way and what those impacts look like. Some of the best work on the subject, which I'll point you to if you're curious, is done by Michael Muller-Smith. He has a forthcoming paper that will dive into a similar subject. And of course, the great sociologist, Diva Pager, who unfortunately passed away. Some of her work on using an audit study where you basically send out fake resumes and see indicating a prison stay or not indicating a prison stay and see which employers bite. It's sort of the foundation of this field. Her and Bruce Western really are some of the giants in this field, and we're indebted to their work. Bruce Western actually reviewed a draft of this paper, so we're especially indebted to his work. One of the big things we set out to study is the effect of involvement in the criminal justice system that stops short of prison. There's been some work on the subject, and by no means am I going to disparage the work of others that come before us. There's some work, though, that seems to equate the effect of conviction and imprisonment. I just don't think that's true. By common sense, that doesn't strike me as reasonable. Yeah, it just it didn't square with my understanding of the system. So we set out to add some additional information to that survey. One note, and I know we're going to hear about this from Professor Mason, whose work on misdemeanors is really pioneering. We talk about the effect of a misdemeanor, but we're very candid in our report, which I'd love you all to read, of course, about the limits of the category misdemeanor. It's a very fuzzy category, as Professor Mason's work delves into at length. We're really limited by the available data on the criminal justice system. It's really bad. I see nodding. Yeah, criminologist and eminent Twitterer John Pfaff, who you all might know well, he chronicles this at length, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but if you know his work, you know I'm not the first to complain about the poor quality of criminal justice data. We work with what we've got. So with that in mind, I'll tell you what we found in our research. But just to give you a background of how a report like this comes together, and then I'll dive into these findings. This was really a product of years and years of work, including myself, other attorneys at the Brennan Center, at least 2 economists that we worked with, and several researchers, as well as our incredible communications team at the Brennan Center. The report was started as sort of started as a question about if you were to add up the lost earnings faced by people who have spent time in prison, would you get a really large number? And would that really large number be compelling to policymakers? Like if I could tell you that 2% of GDP is lost due to underemployment and unemployment related to incarceration, would that shock policymakers? The answer is probably yes, and it turns out if you add up lost earnings at that aggregate level, you do get a sufficiently shocking number, which you'll see at the bottom right. But in the course of our years of research, and I'm indebted to my co-author, Dr. Terry and Craigie here for really realizing this, the story was not so much the aggregate, the story was about individuals. When we started hitting on results showing that people in prison lose half of their annual earnings after incarceration, we realized that what we're looking at is an individual story about income inequality, wealth inequality, and racial inequality, because these results are unfortunately highly racialized. Terry Ann, who's a tenured professor at Smith College, realized that, and with her, we sort of reoriented the report around this focus on individuals, which I think made it both much more important, much more timely to speak to the moment we're in. So our findings, some of which I think draw on some previous research, we find that there are 7.7 million people who have been to prison in the United States at some point in their life alive today. I say today, the report is like based on 2017 data, so let's conflate the two and move on, I suppose. So we also show that the racial breakdown of the formerly imprisoned population is disproportionate to the population at large, and there's a graph I'll show you later in this presentation that really underscores it. We also show that around 12 million people have been convicted of felonies. I think previous estimates have been around 10 million. Our research used some more up-to-date data, so 12 is about right. The big and surprising data point is that people convicted of misdemeanors numbered in excess of 45 million, which is more than a tenth of the American population. We're not even talking about adults. That's more than a tenth of the country. This number gets a big caveat, though, because we're really pushing the data here. The data on the size of the misdemeanor system, again, pioneered by my co-panelists as well, is really difficult to work with. So we spoke with some other people in the field about this figure, and you should scan it as a guide to the magnitude of the problem rather than a precise figure. Like if you added up every person in the country with a misdemeanor conviction, at least would you get 46.8 million? You'd probably get a very big number that's around there. But whereas the other point estimates I think are a little more precise, this is because of the nature of the data, just a little fuzzier. So the other findings are all about earnings loss. So we show that people in prison lose around half of their lifetime earnings, around $500,000, which is absolutely the difference between poverty and not poverty, and the difference between poverty and deep poverty. these are make or break numbers for economic stability for literally anybody, really, except for the very wealthy, of course. One of the more surprising things was that even misdemeanors have a significant impact on earnings. I think there's a tendency that scholars like again, people on this panel have been pushed back on. There's a tendency to treat misdemeanors as minor. Our research suggests they are not minor, but they're a major driver of economic loss in this country. These are just the top line results. I'd love to talk more about them during the course of the panel. Another thing we were able to reject about, another thing we were able to show about our understanding of the economic consequences of prison is we're able to reject the idea that it goes away. Like it would be tempting and nice to think that, we know that the collateral consequences of prison are huge, but surely they dissipate over time. Our research shows they don't. Instead, it looks more like people who've been to prison are knocked onto a different socioeconomic pathway. By no means are we trying to be determinist in this. Like, no one is condemned to this fate upon their imprisonment. People do incredible things to succeed, obviously. But this reflects what we think the average experience is based on our data. Worth noting that for those convicted of a felony but not sent to prison, the loss in earnings is still quite high, even if it might not be as dramatic a difference between poverty and stability. We were really surprised to find that. We thought that given the size of the effect on earnings due to prison, we thought that that would be the primary driver of the quote aggregate loss, the sufficiently large number I mentioned at the top. In fact, the sheer weight of the misdemeanor system forces it to be the prime driver of economic loss, which is really shocking. Like the impact of a misdemeanor conviction is smaller, but there are so many more people who face it that the aggregate effect is much larger. That suggests that if we're working on criminal justice reform, work to end mass incarceration, but we stop at prison, we're missing a huge piece of the picture. Next, I'm going to try to blaze through these because I definitely want to get to the conversation. We showed huge impacts, huge disparities in experience based on race. The graph you see on the left is the percentage of the US total population stacked up against the formerly imprisoned population. We show that there are roughly equal numbers of people who are white and black who have been to prison at some point in their lives. That is very much not the general population of the United States. Disparities between white and Latino people are still also very significant, but not as severe. The white-black disparity is really bracing. We also show the same on earning trajectory. The earning trajectory we chart for sort of an average person of any race. When we decomposed it by race, the results were fairly bracing. And I think, by the way, this reflects not just the effects of imprisonment, it reflects pre-existing biases in our society. Because we show, on top of everything that we know, that we show in this report about time in prison, we show that people, I want to make sure I get this right, it is easy to stumble over. White people with a conviction record in our data tended to earn more than black people without a conviction record in our data. Which is shocking to think about and just suggests that there's a lot going on here that's not about the criminal justice system. It's about broader structural racism in the country. Worth noting that this is something that sociologist Eva Pager hit on in her own work. This is essentially something similar to what she showed. So we're converging on an understanding of race and justice in this country from two different methodologies, which I think is really important. Like, it's important to see whether, important to come at similar things from different methods. That's it. I could talk about this report for ages. I would love to talk about how we've used it in advocacy. It's been a really important and compelling report for many of the policymakers we've talked to. But I want to make sure to move on to the next phase of the conversation, and I really look forward to it. I'll stop sharing now, but I'll remain a talking head.
Thank you so much, Ames. We really appreciate it. I think it really does set the groundwork for the conversation to continue for the rest of the hour. At this point, we're going to shift gears and hear from another panelist, Jeff. Jeff, you have lived experience interacting with the justice system. And at this point, we're going to turn the floor over to you to talk about your experience and what you've sort of done thereafter, what the initiatives are in the Philadelphia community for ENT generally.
Sure.
So thank you so much for being with us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good. A lot of thumbs up. So it's great. I'm grateful to be here. So you heard my bio, but you didn't really hear my bio. So my bio begins that I was raised in Philadelphia. Always wanted to be a lawyer, and became a lawyer. I was a trial lawyer in Philadelphia, a senior partner in a law firm for 20 years. Tried hundreds of cases in our courtrooms here in Philadelphia and around the country. Practiced before the U.S. Supreme Court. About 10 years ago, I made some really challenging and poor choices in life. And notice the word choices. They were choices. Those choices led to a federal indictment. And a day and time when I stood in a federal courtroom in Philadelphia that I had stood in before probably 50 to 100 times. And I stood there with a courtroom filled with media, family, friends, colleagues, judges that I knew and worked with, but I stood there not as a lawyer, but as a defendant. I was sentenced on that day to 5 years in the federal penitentiary and was remanded from the courtroom and taken to a place in Philadelphia that's adjoining the courtroom, which is our federal prison, and then was transferred to a place called USP Canaan in upstate Pennsylvania. At Canaan, about 85% of the men that are there, their exit date is death. It's a pretty bad place. So what a white Jewish lawyer was doing there at the time? Well, just by happenstance, they killed 2 guards just before I got there, and they needed some people to navigate inside. What you didn't hear about my bio, though, was that what actually happened, and not the facts of the case, because I accepted responsibility for that. But while I was away, I used that time to figure out what my purpose in life was, and started reading voraciously, taught over 50 classes while I was away in everything from GED math to public speaking to business law to anything I could to help the men that I was working with. What you didn't hear is that when I came home from prison, I lived in North Philadelphia and lived in a homeless shelter for about 1.5 years. What you didn't hear was I started my life again teaching GED math at Broad and Lehigh at a little adult literacy center and quickly became a director there. Today, I stand here as an executive director of JEVS Human Services. So JEVS is one of the largest social service and workforce development agencies in the city of Philadelphia. We have 1,900 employees. We operate our Career Link. We have Orleans Technical College we own. I run and oversee all the justice programs, including all the training programs, vocational training programs on State Road. What you didn't hear today was that since that time and since this transformation over it's only been 6 years since I've been home, it was 6 years last Sunday, was I've had the opportunity to be at tables because of my background and because of the color of my skin. And the reality is I tell the story of the men and women that I've been with and work with every single day in the justice space who are black and brown. That Ames very articulately showed through his data what actually happens in the system, because I've lived there. I've lived in the shelter. I understand the challenges. Today I'm a subject matter expert for the U.S. Department of Education, and I sit in the center of workforce development, adult literacy, and criminal justice. And my world is trying to explain to the men and women that are going through the system and those employers that are employing people throughout the country of the challenges, the 44,000 plus challenges that men and women have as they navigate a criminal history and criminal past. There's a great saying, Ames, I think we'll appreciate, is that it was said by Einstein that a person without data is just another person with an opinion, right? So true. So data is important, but there's one thing that's missing from this wonderful report. There's one thing, it's the why. Why? Why is this all happening? Why? Well, we can look at the laws. I'm sure professors are going to talk about constitutional law and other things that are going on behind the scenes. But the why is so important to really understand. And as I talk to people in Washington and across the country, and I work to try and solve some of these problems, the why is interesting because we don't really talk about and consider the why in this report. The why of education and the fact that men and women that are going through the prison system often don't have the skill set and the education to be successful. The why of why aren't we doing more to teach digital literacy behind our walls so that when people come home, they're prepared for what the next step is so that they can understand how to find that career pathway, how to apply for a job, how to survive in our digital world. The why is so important because we think sometimes that it's all about getting people a job. You're told you come home that you need to get the job, go to work, right? But how do you go to work when you still have an addiction issue? How do you go to work when you still have all these other challenges like transportation, or even getting identification, getting a bank account? So disclaimer, I totally am transparent today, and I've lost my filter when I went away. I celebrated last night. I wish I had a video camera, because I think everyone in this room might have appreciated it, some more than others. But when I came home, and this is God's truth, when I came home, my credit score was under 200. I think there are dead people that have credit above 200. But because of my crime, which was financial, and the government took the money that I had, I came home with about $22 in my pocket, because that's all the system enabled me to have. And so last night, I was doing a happy dance in my house, because my credit got up to 700. Now, I wish that for every single person that comes home, because it's hard. It's a struggle. Every single day that I wake up, I am 617-640-66. Every single day. I can't avoid that. And people just don't understand. I went and got my first paycheck when I got home teaching GED math for $7.25 an hour. And you know what? I couldn't even claim my paycheck because I couldn't get a bank account. I had a financial crime and the banks wouldn't give me a bank account. I actually had to get online and get an internet service that was able to cash my check for me. These really practical issues are part of the reason why what Professor Ames, what his data shows is such a reality. Because we don't do enough to think about what we do to fix it. We don't think about the why. And the why is really something that as law students, it can be changed. You eat an elephant one bite at a time. If I told you some of the audiences I've had most recently, I was at the White House last week and met the First Lady. One of the things that I do, I sit on the board of directors of the Coalition on Adult Education in Washington, which is the adult education advocacy arm around the country, and started the Prison Literacy Commission for that organization. And that organization works to get people smarter, both behind and beyond our prison walls. Because if we're going to pass an infrastructure bill of trillions of dollars, that's wonderful. But the people that need it the most are the ones that may not even get any of those jobs because they don't have the education and skill development. It is extremely true that since COVID has opened, that more and more jobs are opening up. I've had more meetings over the past 6 months with employers saying, we need people, we need bodies. And it's not about being bodies, it's about talent. These men and women have been out there for years. You're just recognizing their value. You're just beginning to understand that it's not about their criminal past, it's about the lessons that they learned. It's about what makes somebody a good employee. It's about the value that they bring to your company when they come in and they're on time and they want to work and they want to advance. And they don't want a job that's just going to be an entry-level position that's going to keep them there for 20 years. The most impactful thing of the data that I saw was the reality that many people go through, once you get that felony or misdemeanor conviction in your life, you're not making any more money the rest of your life. You're staying at that level. And that's a shame, because those people have the same amount of talent as others in the company that are advancing at a much faster rate, but for the fact that they have a background. I think that the dynamic and things are starting to change. And maybe it was a little bit of the pandemic. Maybe it was more about just people recognizing. One of my best friends today is a gentleman named Jeff Korsenik. And if you haven't read the book, you have to get it. It's called Untapped Talent. And he's on MSNBC all the time. And he's an economist at Fifth Third Bank in Chicago, one of the largest banks in our country. And Jeff's whole position is that it makes economic sense for our country to invest in the talent. And I would argue somewhere between 70 and 100 million people in our country that have a criminal past that need an opportunity and that are to be gainfully employed and to be successful. So it's kind of remarkable. It's the first time I'm ever in a book, too. So I am really thrilled that he put me in, and he made me promise that I'd do the same. So I guess the lesson out of all of this is that there are a lot of reasons why employers choose to engage or not to engage when it comes to criminal justice and those people that have criminal backgrounds. I think that we all have to be mindful and we have to ask the question of why. We have to put on those glasses of the men and women that we work with, our clients. As you go and you become a lawyer, put on the glasses of your clients and try to understand the challenges that they face. When they're weighing sometimes going to work or feeding their families. When they worry about not going to work because they can't afford feminine products. It's real. My daughter's a rock star. She's 27 years old. And she said to me recently, not recently, about a year ago, she said, "Dad, do you know what period poverty is?" I said, "Enlighten me." And she explained what period poverty was. And for those that don't know, it's women can't afford feminine products sometimes, and they're afraid of going out to school or go to work or anything like that. I came home and first thing I did was I called and I said, all my offices need to stock feminine products for women. And do it discreetly. Just put them in the ladies' room with a help yourself sign. Those little things are the way we chip away at some of those numbers that you see. When you make it easier for people to gain gainful employment and to be successful. I wish for all of you as law students that you get to wear that hat someday, that you put those glasses on so you can see the other side. Now I can't tell you, there's a great book by David Brooks called The Second Mountain. And he talks about the reality that you go through life, you go through law school, you become a lawyer, you become successful as a partner or whatever your mode of success is, and something in life sends you back down the mountain. The book's called The Second Mountain because life really isn't about the first climb. Life is all about what you do on the second climb and that purpose. And it took me 20 years of being a lawyer, 50 years of my life, to understand what my purpose was, what was going to drive me. And the only thing, and I'll leave you with this because I know we have a lot to talk about, the only thing I will tell you is I wish for you the same feeling that I get every single morning when I wake up and my feet can't wait to hit the floor because of the work that I do and the drive that I get from just knowing that I'm having a small impact that could have a huge impact across our society. It's going to take people in this room, our young lawyers, our educators, to really change the system. And I recognize that we have to do it one bite at a time, just like we eat an elephant, but that's okay. So I'm looking forward to your questions, and again, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, appreciate that. And yeah, so if you do have questions, we're sort of a little bit over halfway at this point, and so we're hoping to turn to questions in a few minutes. But now we're going to shift gears away from lived experience and from personal experience, something a little bit more theoretical. I guess, okay. So I'll introduce Professor Mason now. She wrote an amazing piece in 2015 titled Collateral Consequences in the Preventative State, which is really a fascinating piece of writing that we can't really explore as thoroughly as I wish we could. But at its core, that article challenges the consensus view in the literature that collateral consequences, like those that affect economic outcomes or disenfranchisement or other rights reductions that are associated with having a criminal background. So those collateral consequences should not be categorized as punishment. Instead, Professor Mason argues that they're better categorized as predictive risk regulation or preventative justice. So we're hoping that you can help explain to us that punishment-prevention dichotomy, why your view maybe makes more sense, and how collateral consequences should be correctly assessed according to that perspective. Thank you, Professor Mason.
Thanks, Vincent. Can you guys hear me? All right. It's such a pleasure to be here today with Ames and Jeff. And I may not do as much of the technical legal exposition as Vincent expects because I, first of all, just have to say, you two are amazing, amazing people and professionals, and it's such an honor to be here with you. Ames is my law school classmate, and I don't think we've seen each other since we graduated from NYU. But it feels really fitting to be on this panel together because when I wrote this article about collateral consequences, the first paragraph in this article says, 1 in 4 American adults has a criminal record. That statistic includes people who have only been arrested, but the conviction numbers are just as staggering. A recent study finds that 19 million people have a felony conviction. That's about 8% of the adult population, about 1/3 of Black men. Including misdemeanors, the number must be greater still. Nobody's managed to calculate it. I wrote that because I came up north from being a public defender in New Orleans and had decided to turn toward the academy. And the first thing I wanted to grapple with was the legal and sort of theoretical status of collateral consequences of conviction, all of the things that follow, not in the sentence itself when you're convicted of crime, but afterwards, because they, for my clients, they just dwarfed, for most of my clients, the consequences internal to the criminal system. And I hadn't been prepared for that. I had no real sort of legal framework for thinking about collateral consequences. I didn't understand why they existed or what we thought we were accomplishing. And that's what led me to write this piece. But when I sat down to write it, I thought, all right, I've got to situate. I'll just start with some basic statistics. How many people in America have a conviction? And there was no statistic. Like, this was 2015. It wasn't decades ago. It was 2015. There was no official statistic, like no source of national data on how many people had been through the system and been convicted. I spent weeks and weeks trolling the internet to find this one study that I cited, that Ames report cites too, the Sarah Shannon study. And that's it. That's all there was. Which just goes to show what a shift in consciousness there's been since that time. I think the release of this Brennan Center report finally putting numbers to the number of us, of the American populace who are walking through their lives with a conviction represents a real sea change in our collective awareness of just what a massive part of our national identity this phenomenon is, and what a huge challenge for us to deal with. So thank you to Ames. Thank you to Jeff. I loved hearing about your own experience, and I particularly appreciated your emphasis on structural inequality, which pervades and must pervade any legal or policy discussion of mass incarceration and collateral consequences. Very briefly, I just want to refer you all, if you want to better understand some of the sources of structural inequality in America, 2 books are The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, I think, and The Color of Money by my friend Mehrsa Baradaran. It's a history of black banks and the racial wealth gap, but it, for me, made very concrete the ways in which our legal institutions and financial structures have profoundly and concretely created and perpetuated structural inequality over generations. All right. I was planning to talk a bit about the law of collateral consequences of conviction, so I'll just do that for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, if that's okay.
Sounds perfect.
The Brennan Center report focuses on employment consequences of involvement with the criminal legal system. Those are vast and cannot be overstated, but they are just one slice of what are broadly called the collateral consequences of conviction. There are formal collateral consequences of conviction and informal. Formal are all of the legally encoded disqualifications and civil disabilities triggered by criminal conviction, and they exist in every sphere of life, from immigration to housing to, of course, employment to professional licensure, to sex offender registration and gang offender registration, to child custody. Basically anything you can imagine you might want to do in life, there is some set of formal legal barriers triggered by conviction. Then, of course, there's all the informal consequences of conviction, all of the private discrimination, which is even harder to get a grip on. The formal collateral consequences proliferated in the decades between the 70s and the early 2000s, along with all the other tough on crime rhetoric and increased sentencing and expansion of the criminal legal system. They are now contracting a bit, and that's been a really promising and thrilling movement. I'm happy to talk more about that if you want. My article is about the constitutional status of all of these formal civil disabilities triggered by conviction. I mean, they seem really bad. Like, why would we make it impossible for somebody coming out of prison or somebody who's been convicted to have a stable job and regain their ability to function as a productive member of society? Why would we do such a thing? Can there be constitutional challenges to these laws? As Vincent referenced, in the last 10-ish years, there had developed a strain of legal advocacy and legal scholarship arguing that these formal civil disabilities, we should understand them as a form of additional punishment. And we should cast them as punishment for constitutional purposes. This line of argument had some success, notably as Tess back there probably knows in Pennsylvania with respect to juvenile sex offender registration. And it had the greatest impact of that line of argument is that if something is deemed punishment for constitutional purposes, it can't apply retroactively. So for people who were convicted of sex crimes before Pennsylvania's juvenile sex offender registration scheme went bananas and got huge, the constitutional argument is because it's a form of punishment and it didn't apply to them when they were convicted, it can't be applied retroactively. That's great for a limited set of individuals. But I had a problem with this vision that we should understand all collateral consequences as a form of punishment, which was two-part, theoretical and practical. The practical part of the argument is the Constitution doesn't actually limit punishment much at all. So aside from this little prohibition on retroactive application, you don't get anything by calling collateral consequences punishment. Right? Once they're punishment, okay, they can't apply retroactively, but prospectively, yeah, sure, throw it on. We can send kids to prison forever. There's just very little constitutional constraint on punishment. There's the 8th Amendment cruel and unusual punishment clause, but it has no teeth as currently interpreted by the Supreme Court. So that's the practical problem with conceiving of collateral consequences as punishment. Theoretically, I have always thought there's a deeper problem, which is that the logic of these barriers we impose on people with past conviction, the logic is, ooh, these people are dangerous and scary, and we need to protect ourselves from them by shutting them out of various facets of housing and employment and professional careers. That's a preventive, predictive, risk-based logic. And if you call them punishment, you sort of miss that point. I think that kind of preventive, predictive, risk-based logic is really insidious, especially when it applies to a group of people who are disproportionately poor and minority, and that we as a society have funneled into this life path. So the deeper theoretical argument was we need to recognize that's the rationale behind all of these barriers we've set up for people coming out of the system. We need to confront that rationale and how senseless it is and dismantle it on its own terms. If we think there are real risks, let's be honest about what we think those are. Maybe we don't want people with past convictions for abusing elders in a nursing home facility to be able to then work again at a nursing facility, maybe. But let's think through the risk rationales in a honest and coherent way. I'm going to stop talking because I've been rambling, but happy to have more legal conversation later.
Thank you so much. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left in our program. I'll start off by asking a question, which hopefully I can loop Ames and Jeff in on, and then I guess we'll assess the questions that we have in the audience. So the question that I have for you two is primarily policy-based. As I was preparing for this presentation, I was trying to get some sense of the strides we've made towards a more humane post-carceral experience or post-justice involvement experience. And it seems as though we have made some significant strides on the policy front. 4/5 of the US population lives in a jurisdiction that has banned the box. The ban the box movement seems like it's been largely successful in sweeping across a lot of jurisdictions. There are large corporate initiatives like the Second Chance Business Coalition that prioritizes hiring justice-involved individuals. In Philadelphia, for example, record sealing and expungement is broadening. And there are also financial incentives to hire those individuals with criminal or backgrounds, including the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, the federal bonding program, and Philadelphia-specific tax credits. So I'm wondering what the low-hanging fruit that still exists is present, what the Brennan Center report recommends, what you've seen in the various organizations in which you work. What else remains? Is it education? Is it working with employers? Where are the strides to come maybe in the next 5 to 10 years? I guess we'll start with you, Ames, and then we'll switch over to our in-person panelists.
Yes. Yeah, happy to. So do you ever write something and then when it's out in the world, you realize you forgot something big?
Yeah.
Because I did, because we wrote this report without mentioning clean slate reforms, which I think is a glaring oversight. Unless you probably read it more recently than me, unless you saw it mentioned, but I think we completely missed it. And that's a huge mistake. So you alluded to this, but I just want to go into more depth. So there's been a real expansion of laws around the country that allow people to seal or totally expunge an old criminal record. But they don't just allow people to do that, they do it automatically. So like, you don't have to wait 10 years, find a lawyer, file the paperwork, wait for the DA to respond. When the DA responds, you hire a lawyer. You wait for the process to resolve. You wait for the order. You file the order with the clerk, blah, 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 blah. Instead, you wait the statutory period of time without committing a crime, and the conviction is gone. And when the conviction is gone, whether it be sealed or expunged, in most cases, that means you can legally deny the conviction to an employer. An employer will say, like, have you committed shoplifting? And you can say no. And if they pull your record sheet and they find that record, they can't deny you the job if they know that it's sealed. That's how the best laws work. A lot of states do have sealing and expungement laws. Pennsylvania was one of the first states to adopt an automatic clean slate law. But they're not as expansive or as timely as they should be. By and large, the waiting periods are pretty long, on the order of 5 to 10 years to get a record automatically sealed. There are huge carve-outs for a wide variety of offenses, like in some states, like so-called violent offenses can't get sealed or expunged. I think we're moving into a period of time where we're going to start seeing like second-generation clean slate laws. We worked very closely with coalition allies in New York on a New York clean slate law, which would have been a sort of best in its class wish list law. That it would have sealed misdemeanors after a year, which is great, which means that people can be back in the workforce that much sooner. It would have expunged misdemeanors, so completely gone after 3 years. For felonies, I think it was 3 and 7 or something like that. The compromise text that very nearly passed the Senate last year stripped out the expungement half, so it only dealt with sealing, and it postponed the timeline to 3 and 7 years for misdemeanors and felonies. That's still like a great law. There are currently no offense-based carve-outs except for sex offenses. So I think we're moving to a period where we're seeing like these next generation better clean slate laws, and I'm really, really hoping that that passes New York State this year. This might be low-hanging fruit that's partially dropped. So people love talking about the 1984 crime bill. A lesser-known part of the 1984 crime bill did something that Mr. Abramowitz referred to, is it made it so that people who were in prison could not receive Pell Grants, and that overnight really killed the prison education field. Like you talk to experts, like the folks at Barred Prison Initiative, it literally like almost killed the entire field of prison education overnight. They adapted because they're extremely smart people. But that Pell Grant ban was quietly repealed in a Trump-era budget bill. The fact that something that was from the 1984 crime bill could be like quietly repealed without attracting consternation from people nationwide is like a good sign, but I could talk for hours about the unique factors that combine to make that possible and the First Step Act possible, but difficult to replicate, let's put it at that. But there are also state laws that prevent people in prison from getting state grants to finance their education. In New York, they're TAP grants is what they're called, and people can't get TAP grants in New York State if they're in prison. Those laws are starting to fall. There's a coalition called Turn on the Tap that some people are leading in New York. So I think those are sort of the next things that are going to happen. I'm really interested in those. Sort of the not low-hanging fruit would be expensive because it would be robust funding of. It's almost difficult to conceive like a fully expansive, holistic approach to reentry that does not just give people a bus ticket and a few dollars and when on their way out of prison. But like conceiving of what those programs look like and implementing them at scale, that's sort of the moonshot and really important.
So I got a lot on this one, sorry. Can you hear me? So a few things. First is that we have 48% of our prison population is incarcerated today because of technical violations on probation or parole. Think about that. These are people who already did their time, got caught into something when they were out, and now they're back inside again. So I think we have to be mindful of that. We have over 500,000 people in the United States today that are incarcerated and have not been convicted. Why is that? They can't afford bail. We have a bail system that puts people behind the walls before they've even had a chance to have their day in court. So when we talk about the low-hanging fruit, let's look at probation and parole reform. Let's talk about that. We talk about expungements, but our laws in Pennsylvania, which are progressive, and I'm at that table. I'm in the governor's office. I oversee the employment subdivision for the Pennsylvania Reentry Council, for the Attorney General, and sit on the governor's Pennsylvania Workforce Development Board. I'm at those tables having these discussions, and our expungement laws, as much as we think that they do good, the reality is for the ground, the boots on the ground, the men in North Philadelphia and women that are filing for expungements, they can't wait 3 years for an expungement to go through the process. Not only that, some of the provisions of our expungement laws, one of the provisions still shocks me that you need to be dead for 10 years to get an expungement in some cases. Felonies, by and large, are not expungible in Pennsylvania, period. You got to go for a pardon. So that's the big thing. And the governor only issues so many of those no matter what. So when we talk about pardons and expungements, I will say the clean slate law, which is a remarkable law, but it's automatic, and it's also really, really low-hanging fruit. It's the kind of things that you did because you got pulled over because you passed a bus in a bus zone, and you got one of those serious tickets kinds of things. And those are automatic expungements or automatic relief that comes off your record because of non-convictions. They're really small, minor offenses, and those aren't the ones. And I want to just mention ban the box, because ban the box is a law that says in Philadelphia, it's not in every county, in Philadelphia, that you can't ask the question to a person, have you ever been convicted of a crime? You can't do it on a job application. You can't do it during a job interview. You can only ask that question once you've given the person a conditional offer of employment. Professor, I'd like to hire you for $10 an hour, and I need to ask you, is there something in your background that would stop you from being allowed to do this job? That's when you can ask it. So what's happened in Philadelphia on the streets where I live and work, it's forced two things to happen. One, people to lie, right? Which is really bad to begin with. Or for people not to disclose, and they go through the process and the employer, they start off on the wrong foot because it's dishonesty and the employer won't give them the job. There was a great study in Michigan that came out which really looked at ban the box and what happens in ban the box. And what often happens is you have people, employers making judgments based upon the way someone looks, as opposed to hiding something or hiding behind this curtain. So I think ban the box, as well intended as it is, its alternative consequences are really challenging and something that you're going to be seeing more and more. I know 2 studies pending now, really diving into ban the box and whether it works or not. And so I think the low-hanging fruit, to be honest with you, is really looking at diversion programs and how instead of putting people into jail, we can give them an opportunity to be diverted from the system and do some good and then learn their lesson in a different way without getting stuck with a record that's going to stick with them the rest of their lives.
Can I jump on?
Oh, yeah.
So here to everything that Ames and Jeff said. On diversion, there's a great recent study out of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, where Boston is, finding it's a randomized quasi-experimental study by good economists, finding that diverting people out of the misdemeanor system not only improves their long-term outcomes, but reduces recidivism, reduces rearrest and reconviction. So that's good evidence for the efficacy of diversion, sort of mass diversion at the lower level. On Ban the Box, Sonia Starr from Michigan and Amanda Agan have a series of studies that I think now have been replicated in a New York Times article explaining their results, which is when you don't let employers ask if people have a criminal conviction, which has a disparate impact on people of color, they just don't hire Black men. So the racial disparities get worse. I'll say nothing more about that. And on probation and parole, I can't endorse this recommendation enough. I think probation reform is incredibly important. There's untold billions of people on probation, and it impedes people's ability to live in all kinds of ways.
I can't believe I forgot diversion. It's such an important program. That Suffolk study is really great. Yeah.
No worries. We will not hold it against you. At this point in time, I'm going to share the second CLE password. The second CLE passcode is brownie. Delicious, surely, but it's brownie. So we're sort of at the end of our time here. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that you'd like to share while we have an audience, I guess. I don't know. And then kind of bring this to a close. I kind of didn't, I'm not sure. Jeff, is there anything you'd like to say to conclude at this point? I apologize. I know this is a broad question.
We could go for a while.
We could go for a while here.
No, I know, look, I've sat in your seat. I went through law school. I went and practiced law. And I will tell you that there's not a day of my life that I ever regret being a trial lawyer. But there's also another side of me that says that for a long time, I just didn't see it. I just didn't see or understand what the work that I was doing and the impact that it had. And just real quickly, I was with the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education recently, and he asked me about my numbers, my data, my facts. And I said, the reality of the work that I do is that I can't give you that data. And he said, why not? You work for a huge agency, you do great stuff. And I was like, because the work that I do is reflected in the 5-year-old who goes to school with a full belly, who has new sneakers, who is proud when mom and dad are with him at parent-teacher conference, is going to grow up and see parents that were successful, that are working, and he's going to go to college, or she's going to go to college. They're going to be successful, and they're not going to be in touch with the criminal justice system. And that's impossible to quantify. So when you work and as you go through your law practice and figure out where your lane is, just ask those hard questions. Put those glasses on to the people that you work with and try and understand the challenges that they face and the barriers, the collateral barriers that are right in front of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much for wrapping it up so succinctly. What I'll say is I hope that you all enjoyed this conversation and maybe don't lose track of our panelists tonight. I would recommend following Ames on Twitter. It's a very vibrant Twitter presence, and he's recently involved in a podcast that I'm sure was very entertaining. Jeff has a book coming out, I think, did you say next spring?
South by Southwest in March.
So there's a book coming out in March that we'll flag and circulate as it's published. And Professor Mason may be your professor in the spring, or otherwise we'll just keep track of what you're putting out in law review journals. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here, and have a good night. Please thank your families.
Thank you all.